So today we're just going to do an overview of sentence structure essentials and the four very common sentence types, plus one that's not quite as common, but I teach it together because it's often confused with one of the really common ones. Okay, so simple sentence. The technical term that we're going to use very often in the course is an independent clause. Independent simply means that something can be by itself and it makes sense by itself. Now, you hear me using the word clause quite a bit. So in grammar, we're not talking about contracts. In a contract, a clause is a condition, but in grammar, a clause refers to a subject and a predicate. Now, most people are familiar with what a subject of a verb is. Like if I say, I love pizza, I is the subject. So predicate means the verb plus the stuff after the verb, which is very often an object. So in the example sentence, I love pizza is the predicate. The verb is love, pizza is the object. So just to be crystal clear, I is the subject, love is the verb, pizza is the object. Okay, so this is an independent clause. It's a simple sentence. It can stand by itself. It makes sense by itself. Compound sentence is simply two independent clauses joined together by a coordinating conjunction. So the coordinating conjunctions are known by the acronym SOIBAN. SOIBAN, these are all 2- and 3-letter words. These are the most common, most basic joining words. Conjunction means joining word. SOIBAN includes so, or, yet, but, and, nor. So an example of a compound sentence would be, I love pizza, I eat too much of it, okay? How can we put these together? Which of these coordinating conjunctions could we use to join these two simple sentences?
And.
And I eat too much of it? Sure. And would work. Which one is, do you think is more common?
So.
But it's a contrast, right? I'm complaining. So that's all a compound sentence is. This is a very simple way of putting a couple sentences together. So third level would be a complex sentence, and we're going to talk about the two most common kinds of complex sentences. So a complex sentence includes an independent clause, which we've talked about, and it also includes a dependent clause. So a dependent clause also has a subject and a predicate, just like an independent clause. But it doesn't make sense by itself. So I'm just going to write that. Includes a subject and predicate, just like an independent clause, but it doesn't make sense on its own. An example of that would be, because I love pizza. So I love pizza by itself is an independent clause, and it's perfectly fine on its own as a complete sentence. But as soon as you put one of these words in front of it, it stops making sense on its own. All right, so just looking at our previous example, I love pizza, but I eat too much of it. So we could do, because I love pizza, I eat too much of it. I eat too much of it is our independent clause. That can be a sentence by itself. Because I love pizza is a dependent clause. It's a subordinate clause. Okay. You can flip the order of these. You can say, I eat too much. We'll say pizza at the beginning because I love it. I just swapped it and pizza. So the because can come before or after. Subordinate clauses begin with these kinds of words. These are called subordinating conjunctions. So we've got because, since, while, very often when, although, though, even though, whenever. These are very common subordinating conjunctions. So this is our second kind of conjunction. We've got coordinating conjunctions to join together compound sentences. And then we've got subordinating conjunctions, which begin subordinate clauses. So this type of conjunction should be easy to remember. Just remember that subordinate clauses go together with subordinating conjunctions. Then we get to our relative clause. Relative clauses are called relative clauses because they are related to the noun that comes before them. They begin with a relative pronoun. Relative pronouns are who, that, which, and also, less commonly, whom, where, and when. In many books, many grammar books, these are also called adjective clauses because they function like adjectives. So adjectives go before a noun. If I say I have a big dog, big is an adjective, it goes before the noun dog. If I have a more complicated modifier for a noun, it needs to go after the noun. So if I say, for example, let's say I have a friend who lives in Montreal and he's coming to visit me, I could say, my friend who lives in Montreal is coming to visit. The independent clause is my friend is coming to visit. The relative clause, the dependent clause, is who lives in Montreal. And adjectives go in front of nouns. So my good friend, that would be an example of an adjective. But this is too complicated to express in a single adjective. So we put it into a relative clause and we have to put it directly after the word it's related to. That's how we remember it. Like your relatives, people that come to your house on Thanksgiving, they are related to you. That's why it's called a relative clause, because it's related to the noun that comes right before the clause. There are what we call defining relative clauses. I'm just going to put RC, and there are non-defining relative clauses. Defining relative clauses are needed to understand which specific thing you're talking about. So I'll give an example that I frequently give. The machine that we bought last week has broken down already. So the independent clause is the machine has broken down already. And the dependent clause, the relative clause, is that we bought last week. If we don't include this information, we don't know which machine you're talking about. So that's why this kind of relative clause is called a defining relative clause. It's necessary to understand which machine we're talking about. Notice there are no commas, and we read it straight through. The machine that we bought last week is broken down already. Now, a non-defining relative clause is very similar, but in this case, the relative clause is an additional detail. We don't need it to understand which specific thing you're talking about. So here's a very similar example. The Z2000, which we bought last week, has broken down already. So again, we've got our independent clause, the Z2000, has broken down already. The difference is, in the first example, the machine is non-specific. But in the second example, the Z2000, it's very specific, so the person you're talking to knows already what you're talking about. In this case, the relative clause is an additional detail. Notice it goes inside commas. And when you read it, there are clear pauses here. The Z2000, which we bought last week, has broken down already. So in terms of the relative pronouns that we use, in this first case, with the defining relative clause, it's your choice whether to use that or which. Both are perfectly fine. But in the second example, where it's a non-defining relative clause, inside commas, do not use that. It's wrong. For people, use who in both cases. Okay, don't use which for people, just stick with who. That brings us to the fourth kind of sentence we're going to talk about today, which is a semicolon sentence. This is our third kind of conjunction. So a semicolon sentence, the formula is quite straightforward. We've got an independent clause followed by a semicolon. This could be a period too, by the way, but followed by a semicolon, followed by a conjunctive adverb, followed by a comma, followed by another independent clause. An example of this would be, I love pizza. And instead of saying, but I eat too much of it, I can do semicolon. The conjunctive adverb equivalent of but is however. So however is a synonym for but we don't use them in the same way, grammatically speaking. Semicolon, however, comma, I eat too much of it. So this is our independent clause, I love pizza. This is our other independent clause. So notice, we use this construction between two independent clauses. So then we've got our semicolon, conjunctive adverb, comma. So what are some common conjunctive adverbs? We've got however, therefore, moreover, furthermore. We also have phrases like as well. Notice this is not as well as, it's just as well. Also, adverbs like finally, strangely, lots and lots of adverbs will work in this way. Unfortunately, phrases like on the other hand. So in all these cases, you can begin a sentence with any of these words. Instead of using a semicolon here, you can just put a period. You have to keep the comma, though, after the conjunctive adverb. In any case, you can replace the period with a semicolon, and this adds to your sentence variety. So this is often used where you've got this kind of conjunctive adverb splitting two very closely related ideas. Okay. Let's briefly talk about the two most common issues related to sentence structure. These are among the 4 killers that will wreck your score in terms of grammar. Fragments, sentence fragments, run-ons, so run-on sentences. The other 2 killers are subject-verb agreement and pronoun antecedent agreement, but those are separate issues for another day. So fragments. If you just wrote, because I love pizza, period. So I'm going to put them here. If you just write, because I love pizza, period, that's what's called a sentence fragment. Right? And in your writing, I'll put SF. This is half of an idea. Because I love pizza, so what? What's the main idea? What's the concluding idea? Even though it's cold. All of these are fragments. They would be sentences on their own. I'm at work, it's cold, I love pizza. If it weren't for the subordinate conjunction at the beginning. As soon as you put one of these words in front of an independent clause, it stops being an independent clause and it becomes a dependent clause. So all we're missing here is an independent clause in all of these cases. So if you don't have an independent clause, you've got a fragment. The other killer issue, I'll put ROS if you have one of these, is a run-on sentence. And a run-on sentence means you've got two or more independent clauses that are not separated or joined properly. Say, I love pizza, I eat too much. This is the most common kind of run-on sentence. You've got two independent clauses, I love pizza and I eat too much, but they're separated with a comma, which you're not allowed to do. If you do that, that's what's called a run-on sentence, and more specifically, a comma splice. These are usually the same thing. So again, your choices are, you can simply use a period. So you need simple sentences. I love pizza, period. I eat too much. You can create a compound sentence. I love pizza, but I eat too much. You can create a complex sentence. While I love pizza, or even though I love pizza, although I love pizza, I eat too much. Or you can use a semicolon. I love pizza, semicolon, however, comma, I eat too much. Your ears can help you catch these issues. Grammar is largely auditory. When you're reading your work out loud, if you find yourself pausing naturally, you probably need punctuation. Short pause, you probably need a comma. Long pause, there's a good chance you need a period. But then when your ear catches this kind of point, you have to ask yourself, before I pause, is it an independent clause or a dependent clause? Okay, if it's an independent clause and a dependent clause, if you've got those two side by side, you probably need a comma. But if you have an independent clause and another independent clause next to it, be very careful. There's a good chance you need a period, or you can combine those two together in another way.